What I want to do is give you some trends and some tips, right? So you're not just thinking about today, but you're thinking about tomorrow and how things change and how you might adapt to those changes. So broadly, as you think about learning, and it could be in a corporate setting or it could be in an institutional setting, higher education, but learning is becoming more active and engaging, just like we did. We had some presentations, some discussions, some activities, gave you a chance to turn to, learn from, learn with your neighbor, build some connections, build some rapport. Um, that's kind of the way that things are going, and for good reason. There's lots of great research on the efficacy of active learning. My favorite is a study in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences that looks at it's a meta-analysis of like 200 some studies, and it shows that it cuts failure rates in half. So it definitely works. Getting people together, they build relationships. Then you know who to, in our case, you know who to talk to at the cocktail hour. But in an academic context, you know who to work with on your problem set or your homework. But it's also learning is also becoming more flexible, more technology rich, with people expressing preferences for more blended, hybrid online options. And every year, Brightspot does a national student experience study. And one of the interesting things we found, and it aligned with a larger study by EDUCAUSE, is 20% of undergrads now are looking for fully online education. Part of that is that their undergrads aren't just 18-year-olds, but so learning is becoming more flexible, more active, more engaging, more experiential, with chances to apply what you're learning, like in an activity or on an internship or a real world project, that allows students to find a purpose, find a path, build relationships. You can imagine, let's say you're taking a marketing class. 20 years ago, maybe you would do that marketing plan for a fictitious company. Now the push is go out and talk to like a nonprofit in the community or a startup, or go talk to real people who have real problems that you can help solve. And that gives you a chance to apply what you're learning and build some skills, build relationships. Maybe that nonprofit needs an intern this summer. So becoming more active, more experiential, more applied, more technology rich and flexible. Research, as you think about the research side, and of course, not totally distinct from instruction, and in any context, becoming more computational and more collaborative and more impact driven, right? Lots of organizations, institutions have grand challenges, or they have kind of like big audacious goals, big societal problems they're trying to solve with their research, and they're really they're measuring the impact and touting it in terms of their societal benefit. And a lot of those big problems, whether it's income inequality, poverty, pandemic, those are complex problems that require different disciplines to come together. So much more collaboration, more shared space, working across disciplines, getting people from different backgrounds, who use different tools, who maybe think different ways, to work together, often to share space, share equipment, share data, share tools. And the research itself is becoming more computational, simply because there's more computing power, and there's more you can do with that power. So there's not just in vivo or in vitro, there's in silico research, and that computational research is unlocking new discoveries. So that means different things for space. Most places are adding dry labs faster than they're adding wet labs, but both are important. And they're also adding a lot of damp labs, right, where it's kind of like hopefully that doesn't mean your computers are wet, but what it does mean is that there's sort of a mix of the two, right, where you maybe are fabricating things, you're building a way to sense or measure an experiment or robotics. And And then as you think about student life and wellness, at a university or in the workplace, um, there's a real focus on belonging and building community and finding ways for people to feel connected to each other, to something larger, to a mission, to a purpose, um, and to be cognizant of and working to alleviate mental health concerns. I think one of the statistics that struck me, there's a great study called the American College Health Assessment that's done by the National College Health Association. Only 65% of students feel like they belong. A third of students have an anxiety diagnosis, and a quarter have a depression diagnosis. So if you were unclear about a mental health crisis, in higher ed, the numbers are stark, and it's something that you can't just solve by throwing more counseling at it. It actually takes a holistic approach, thinking about how students build relationships, how they get mentoring, how they find support, how they build a network to support them, everything from faculty to friends to RAs to peer mentors to their boss, at work at their campus job. And finally, work is becoming more flexible, more hybrid, and hopefully more equitable and inclusive as people have more options in where and how and when and with whom they work. And that work is taking place in space and online and between. And we've kind of settled into, what a year and a half ago we would have called the new normal. And there's great evidence of this. Stanford researcher Nick Bloom started a research group called the Work from Home Research Group, and they do a monthly report. If you haven't seen it, or you don't follow him on LinkedIn, I recommend it. But they have great data on how kind of things have normalized nationally. About 30% work from home, and that's been consistent for I think 9 months now. So pretty much the way people are working now is kind of they've now settled into a groove. And so if you have a lot of empty space, especially on Mondays and Fridays, that's kind of how it's going to be. And so now is the time to think about, do you have the right amounts and the right kinds and the right place of your space? So those are some big, broad trends we're seeing in how learning and research and life and work are changing. And I don't want you to get, and those are big changes. That can be overwhelming. That can be daunting. So I want to give you a few tips for how you might kind of grapple with change. And a lot of these are also kind of pitfalls that we often see folks stepping in, or we try to root them around. So I think the first is, as you're thinking about the future, you really want to think about like space, IT, HR working together. Like if you're doing a project and you don't have all three of those perspectives like at the table, you're probably missing something, because any space change is gonna result in some kind of organizational change. It might be big, like a whole reorganization, or it might be small. But like I said before, like you don't want to have a new space that you use the old way. That doesn't make any sense. So, as otherwise, might as well leave it alone. So just be thinking about how those different perspectives come together and who's at the table, especially if you're thinking about some kind of workplace project. And as you're gathering data, as you're coming up with findings, recommendations, it's really useful to think about how you parse them for action. So the example here was a survey we did, a workplace survey, and we knew there were certain questions that IT was going to take the lead on responding to. If people talk about having the tools to work flexibly, for instance, versus if somebody doesn't think they have like clear performance goals, that's kind of an HR thing to follow up on. Or if they don't have the right amounts or the right kinds of space or places to concentrate or places to collaborate. That's more facilities. So think about how you bring those together. The other thing we see get in the way of folks adapting is when they have data and systems that don't talk to each other. And we see this a lot. And in fact, a couple of years ago, we did a project that was like a total gut punch, because a university had space data from their CAFM system. So they knew how much of what kind of space, numbers of offices, square footage in those offices. And then they had a separate system with who was in those offices. And they didn't connect. So they paid us. They said, can you do 30 department head interviews and use that to verify who has what space and who's in what space? And we said, sure. But as soon as we finish that, it's going to be out of date. You'd be much better off to just write a script or to create a dynamic link so that, you can export from one to the other. And when you do get the new office for the head of DEI, all that, that Excel spreadsheet that Brightspot creates isn't out of date. You have a dynamic link. So wherever you can connect these things, I encourage you to do so, because this is one of these things where your data and your tools can slow you down if you're not careful. The other thing is that when you're thinking about the data, it's really good to look at it from different perspectives. We were talking about this earlier, trust, but verify, and think qualitatively, quantitatively, subjectively, objectively, to get the whole picture. So for instance, like this is an example of pairing survey data where people talk about where and how they spend their time with observation data of where they actually spend their time. And then you can link to. Sometimes they're related, sometimes they're not. Generally, I find that when people talk about how they spend their time, they're pretty accurate on a relative basis, so they get the proportion right. It's just we all overestimate our productivity. So on an absolute basis, we think we're like being productive 100% of the day, but actually it's like 60 or 80% of the day. So but the proportions generally are pretty good. But you want to be able to learn that for yourself by comparing different measures. The other thing that will help you adapt is being really clear on your terminology. And there's certain things that are often confused. Space utilization is one of them. Sometimes people say space utilization, and they mean how much space does a given department have assigned to them. Other times people say space utilization, and they mean of the amount of time that this room could be booked, how much is it booked? And then other times people say space utilization, and they actually mean occupancy, which is how full it is. And they say of the seats in the room, how many are full? So we run into this all the time. And my preference is when you're thinking about how much space is assigned, you talk about that as space allocation or space assignment. When you're talking about how full the calendar is, how much time, you use utilization for that. And we were talking about seats, how full the seats are, you use that in terms of occupancy. You may already have kind of enshrined ways of thinking about this at your organization, at your institution. That's fine. Just make sure they're clear to all the people involved, because what you don't want is people conflating different measures. Because, for instance, if you're talking about a classroom, you want to target at least 65% utilization, right? Of the scheduled hours, you want at least 65% full. But your target for occupancy, how many seats are full, that should probably be more like 80% or 90%. Because then that shows you have a good fit between the sizes of classes and the sizes of rooms. So really important to kind of distinguish the terminology. The other thing that I think will really help you as you're thinking about the future is doing it step by step as you're forecasting future needs. A lot of times people they'll do an analysis of the current space. How much space do I have how much lab, how much office, how much event space, so forth. And then they'll do they'll say, well, we're growing by 20%. So I'm going to grow the space by 20%. But the thing is, you miss a step in there, which is understanding how well what you have today is working. And so that's why we always recommend doing a right size option first. So you say, what do we have today? And then what would right size for today be? Maybe you need more labs, less office, more meeting, less classroom, whatever it might be. So you say, assuming that we have the same headcount, same people, same personnel, same faculty, same staff, same students, what would a right size look like for today? Then you scale that up. Then you apply your 20%, let's say, if you're growing to that, because that way you're not mixing the data. And it's very easy to tell people, okay, this part of the change is about right sizing, and then this part of the change is about growing or consolidation or shrinking. We find it very helpful to break those up. And then benchmarking, talked about this earlier, right? It's the fastest way to be average. And that can be a good thing. It can give you the ballpark. But be really careful when you're prescribing, you're using benchmarks to prescribe a solution. Say, okay, we looked at these 10 peers, we're going to shoot for the average. You should know more. You should be able to look behind the data, understand why you're different, how you're different. If somebody's, if one of your peer institutions is the aberration, why is that? For instance, you might look at benchmarking data and you might say, gosh, we have much fewer classroom space than our peers. Maybe that's because you have more of your classrooms are centrally scheduled in a pool, and so they show up in a different place. Or maybe it's the opposite. So benchmark with care, I guess, is the message here. And I think just always be wary of averages, because averages can really distort things. The way I like to tell this is I'll illustrate this is combined. Michael Jordan and I averaged 3 NBA championships, right? So that puts me at the top. With 3, that puts me near the very top. So averages can be very misleading. And I think the other thing is, as you're thinking through the kind of the ripple effects of the pandemic, we see empty office spaces for sure, or more empty office spaces. But I think the larger lesson is that people are the draw for other people, right? Or in the workplace. Colleague, friend of mine at McKinsey, Phil, likes to say people are the most attractive amenity to draw people to the workplace. So I think we learned that for colleges as well. Students weren't clamoring to get back into the back row of a lecture hall, right? It was to get into the lab, the studio, the dorm, the dining hall, the residence hall, and so the big thing we learned is we could do more online, but it would mean more in person. So I think that's really, over time, that's going to shift the proportion of spaces so that the spaces you have for people to be together, to interact, to make stuff, to do what they can't do online or can't do as well, to really focus on that in person.